This is the Lore Runner. Calling for evacuation. Survivor. One too many. Oh, God. Wait, no, hang on. There's good and pure things in the universe. Before we go any further, I rated this game a 0 on the golden number. I'll talk more about that and explain that later. But if that colors or changes your opinion of my thoughts on the game, and its design, and its concepts, and its story, and its narrative, I wanted to get that out nice up in front. I'd rather be honest about that than try to string you along in hopes that you'll watch more of the video. So, warning given. Still a little snuffly. My apologies. Didn't even mean to do that inhale. I was trying to inhale normally, because I can breathe through my nose now, and it's like, I might mute that in post. Some people have asked, Lore, why haven't you covered this game yet? It's your bag. I mean, it's an FPS, and we all do, well, actually it's a TPS, but whatever. I do like shooter games. I have for a long time. And big lore focus. Cool. Awesome. The reason, it's actually a twofold reason. The original reason is very simple. When the game came out, I was like, oh, that looks interesting. I'll have to look into it. And I happened across an interview. I'm not going to name names. I actually came across 2 separate interviews and a couple of threads. The interview was, how do I say this as nicely as possible? It was rather pretentious, and it posited a theory and an idea that I didn't agree with. It was an attitude of derogatory intent and tone towards the players, that is to say, people who play video games, and it was also rather conciliatory. One of the phrases that was mentioned was, well, just don't play the game if it bothers you. You know, if you have an issue with that, then just turn off the game. If you were around when this game was coming out, you may have seen or heard that exact same phrase. I have, by several people who have defended this game. You know, well, if you have a problem with it, just stop playing it. I find that to be an extremely invalid defense, personally. So much so that I don't even feel the need to go into it. But the reason I'm bringing this up is that was my first exposure to Spec Ops: The Line. And I said, oh, okay, and just noped that out of my mind for the rest of, you know, like however many years that was at that point. I got other stuff to do, right? Now, some years passed, and someone else brought it up. I forget who. It was actually a friend of mine. And they were like, hey, you know, what do you think? As I haven't played it. Oh, you haven't played it? You should play it sometime. And I related the exact same story to them that I just shared to you. And their response was, yeah, no, that's valid and that's kind of dickish, but you should probably at least give the game a shot. It might actually be a good game regardless of that. And I was like, you know what? That's actually a valid point. The problem at that point was that by the time that time rolled around, I was starting to actually do this as my job. And, well, I had a lot of other things to stream and a lot of things to record, and so it just never really came up, right? Until we started getting the system that we've been doing for about the last 5 years or so now, where, you know, you donate to the show to help me do things like have adorable sharks and water and all these awesome things, which I'm very thankful for, by the way. And in exchange for this, or rather, not exchange, not legally in exchange, but as a thank you, I say, hey, what do you want to put that towards as far as showing interest? And several people started funding Spec Ops: The Line. I was like, oh, okay, cool. It'll be cool to finally play it and see what I think of it. I wasn't impressed. Let's start with the gameplay, shall we? So, God, where do I begin? I should mention that one of the first things that happened as I was going through was I ran into a bit of a bug. I was like, okay, I'm going to go through this, and those are controller commands. Okay, no problem. I'll unplug my controller, because I was playing mouse and keyboard. And I unplugged my controller, and it was still the controller icons and the controller things. I was like, okay. Cool. I'll restart the game. Still a problem. Looked a little bit into it. One of my viewers looked into it, shared me a possible fix. The fix involves a mod, and I'm like, okay, no. This is just a bug with the game. I did end up giving this bug a negative. The reason why I wanted to go ahead and play with this on was I wanted to see how much of a hindrance to actual gameplay it was. Spoilers, it was pretty irritating. Anytime it showed up and said, hit the A button, I had to mentally think, okay, what the hell's the A button? And it wasn't always linear. That's the really strange thing. Sometimes it would mean this button, and sometimes it would mean this button. I'm not joking. So, you know, that was fun. Also, there were several times in which I had to go, you know, I had to hit the menu and hit the control rebindings to figure out what a button was in order to be able to figure out how to progress through a level. Not a great way to start. Cool. Cool. So then we got a little bit further in, and I realized very quickly that I wasn't going to like the controls. But here's the thing. How many of you have played a game that you don't like the controls in? I mean, I have, so I'll raise my hand on that one too. I'm sure you could think of at least a few. But the thing is, I like to be a little bit more specific about that if I can. And especially in this case, because this case had multiple issues right here. So I actually wrote them up over here so I could give you specifics. Obviously, so movement is the first problem. Moving around is weirdly sluggish. The best way I could explain it is anybody who's played Red Dead Redemption, or Red Dead Redemption 2, but really Red Dead Redemption 1, it feels like playing a third-person shooter in RDR1. It's got that kind of sluggish, moving a boat around kind of a thing, and you don't turn as fast as you feel like you should. And it takes a little while to get started, and it takes a little while to get stopped. And there was another issue I kept running into. It only happened periodically. Anybody else who had this issue, feel free to share, where I'd start running, and then I want to stop because I was like an enemy or my cover is right there, and I wouldn't stop. I'm no longer hitting forward. I'm no longer hitting sprint, but I would just keep, he's just, I'm going to go. And a couple of times I died from that, and I'm like, not sure what was causing that one. That's problem number one. Problem number two is the aiming. The aiming was made for a controller. Let's just put that as simply as possible. And it's clear they didn't really know how to translate that into a mouse. So, problem number two. Problem number three. This one's a little more complicated to talk about. How many of you saw my rumination on Mario 64 or Mario Sunshine or A Hat in Time? All stuff we've covered pretty recently. None of you? Okay, that's cool. Did you watch the streams at least? So, as we were going through those games, one of the things that all three games have in common is, I forget what it's called, but there's a type of programming. It's a very, 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 very common type of programming. It goes back to the NES era. It's when the game kind of interprets what it thinks you want to do, and it helps you do it, right? Like ledge grabbing is a very, very old concept. That's this type of thing. It's exceedingly common to the point of normal. Thing is, it is possible for it to be very good. See A Hat in Time, for an example. Hat in Time had very good interpretation to the point where the controls felt absolutely fluid. It can also be really bad, like Assassin's Creed 2. Don't jump down my throat. I like Assassin's Creed 2 as much as anybody else, but how many times have you played? I pointed to 2 specifically because I had that problem more in 2, but most of the Assassin's Creed games up to and including 4 had this Rogue had this problem, where it just kind of interprets where you want to jump and how you want to jump, and sometimes you're climbing up a thing and you just go leaping off into your death, or you're trying to stealth around a thing and you just rush out, and you know what I'm talking about, right? Because the game is trying to interpret your input. Now, there's a related thing here, and this is actually specifically why I brought up Assassin's Creed. Because Assassin's Creed also does something that another game, Ocarina of Time, does. Context-sensitive input. So when you're designing a game for a controller, you don't have that many buttons to work with. You do have several, especially nowadays, but you don't have a keyboard, right? So you're trying to figure out how to make some of these things work, and one of the most common methods is to say, well, okay, this button does this, but under this circumstance, this button does something else, right? Okay, that makes sense. That can cause issues, obviously, but the biggest problems I had were twofold. First of all, sometimes it didn't know how to handle cover. Like sometimes I literally couldn't aim from cover, or it thought I was in cover when I wasn't, or it thought I wasn't in cover when I was, or sometimes it would try to, interact with something when I don't want to because that happens to be the same button as the sprint button, for example, just stuff like that, right? But the other thing I kept running into is, trying to kind of properly explain this. The game doesn't know how to, for some reason, the game decided to make there be a separate button for jumping over cover and vaulting over an obstacle. I'm not joking. It's the run button to get into cover, and then the run button to get into cover. By the way, minor irritation, but a constant one in a game that involves cover-based shooting. You can't run into cover. You have to run up to cover, let go of the run button, and then hit the run button in order to go into cover. Then you get into cover, and you try to leap over it. You leap over the space button, or that is a space bar. It doesn't work. You have to hit the run button a third time to actually go over. Unless it's an obstacle that's in your way, in which case you have to space bar, because shift won't actually work in that case. You'll just do a melee swing. I'm sorry, no, you won't actually do a melee swing. I take that back. The melee swing is the spacebar. You get my overall point, though. I hope I'm at least partially conveying this. The game did not put the amount of thought and effort necessary into making either the interpretive controls or the context-sensitive controls work. That's probably the biggest issue I had with the game by far. The sluggy movement, whatever. The fact that it actually really sucked to aim, I could at least compensate for that like I did in Resident Evil 4. But the fact that it just didn't know what I was doing half the time, and I felt like I was literally out of control of my character, that's just frustrating, especially in a game when you could die in literal seconds to just a second of sustained fire from someone, right? So that's irritating. And that's what I mean when I say the controls were bad. But hang on, my story gets better. So in addition to that, one of the things I talk about a lot, and have talked about recently, is how important it is to make your... Well, I was going to say combat, but it's actually your core mechanic, your core loop. Fun. Now, I don't mean fun as in engaging or depth and all that. That's cool, too. This is separate from that. You want your guns to have oomph. Halo, right? That beautiful sniper rifle in Halo 4, for example. Or the triple chain gun, which I always come back to in Doom 4. Or, I don't know, something else. But you get the general idea, right? Just about all the weapons in Doom 64 have this. You want your weapons to have oomph. If you attack, Dragon Age 2, if you do the attack, you want there to be a sound, visual impact design around it to make it feel like you're doing something cool, to make it more fun. This game had none of that. No good sound design, no good animation design, no good anything. The guns in Resident Evil 4, I hate to keep comparing to this, were more interesting and fun to use than in this game. So that's not great. But that's compounded by the fact that the combat is extremely basic. It's cover-based shooting. That's it. That's the combat. Now, some of you know that I have a concept called Dragon Age 2 Syndrome. This is not that, just to be very clear. Dragon Age 2 Syndrome is when a game has fun but simple combat. Very shallow, but enjoyable. This isn't that. This is shallow and banal. And the problem is, it kind of has all the problems that Dragon Age 2 Syndrome has, and worse. Now, it did take a while. I'll give you that game. It took me until the second to last mission to just be tired of playing it. It was the first time I finally turned the difficulty down, because I was just bored. Because it's just the same cover-based shooting section over and over and over, with only, I'd say, about 3 real exceptions to that. One is the big helicopter sequence. One is when you're going through the mall, and the other guys are on the other side of the mall. And I guess the other one would be when you're hanging on alongside the truck. There's probably a few others now that I'm thinking about it. But the point is, the overwhelming majority of the combat is just cover-based shooting, nothing else added. Now that can work. If you have interesting guns, if you have interesting enemy variety, if the enemies have different styles of attack, if the enemy AI is very well designed. All of these things can make this work. None of those are present here. Point in fact, we actually discussed this on camera when we were streaming it. I would say this has some of the least enemy variety I've seen from this kind of a shooter in quite some time. Because you have enemies with guns of various types, enemies that charge at you with the melee weapon, and then enemies in the armor, and that's actually kind of it. Now I know there's shotguns, and there's machine guns, and there's RPGs, and there's sniper rifles, but the overall approach of the overwhelming majority of the enemies doesn't vary from those 3 archetypes. So you're fighting 3 enemies, for the most part, throughout the entire game, and they don't even design the actual encounters all that well. Now, I could keep sitting here and complaining about this, but I just want to compare this to Resident Evil 4 one last time. If you paid attention during my rumination of RE4, and I sure hope you did, one of the things I praised was how it had multiple different mechanical functions, systems, built into the game that were designed to work with each other in congruent to make one more cohesive and more enjoyable whole. And even that wouldn't have worked if not for the specifics of itemization and encounter design, which complemented that, right? You had to have the system, and you had to have the implementation of the system. Now, this isn't the opposite of that. The opposite of this would probably be Ride to Hell Retribution, actually. But my point is, it feels like they just kind of threw it at the wall and said, here. If you were to Google generic modern shooter, I think is the proper term for the genre, this, in terms of gameplay, this is what would come up. It is bog standard. And so it has nothing going for it. This is by far the biggest reason this game scored a 0, which I will now address that. Because I didn't give this game a single gameplay positive. I should defend myself slightly. 0 is not necessarily bad. It's not great. But because of the way the system works, 0 is right in the middle. It's average, normal, ordinary. If it was in the negatives, that's net negative. If it was in the positives, that's net positive. Smack dab in the middle usually means it's either unremarkable or its positives cancel out its negatives, so it's neutral, right? And that's exactly what this game is, because now we're going to talk about the story. Now, before we get into the story, I cannot discuss the story of Spec Ops: The Line without spoiling the hell out of it. I can't. So, spoiler warning. Spoiler. There's a spoiler coming. Okay, thank you, Cat. My niece named him Cat. I don't know. All right, so the first thing I want to talk about is Mass Effect. I want you to do me a favor, okay? For those of you who are familiar with Mass Effect, I want you to think about a group of 3 Spectres, okay? And they're elites, they're veterans, they've got all the support and all the leeway, and they've got the council behind them, and they go into a fairly dangerous, but nevertheless, the kind of situation that Spectres are supposed to deal with thing, and in the course of about a day, they just completely mentally descend into mania and hallucinations and insanity and raving and screaming and all of the things that happen in this game. And you already see the point I'm making. Now, I do like the narrative of this game, let me be clear. But I'm starting with this because this is by far the biggest detriment to the story, in my opinion. This story's structure defeats itself. The plot and the themes are both hindered by the fact that I just don't buy it at all. You send in 3 Delta Ops into this nonsense, and in the space of a day. Now, there's 2 relatively simple ways they could have fixed this. Way number 1, make it occur over longer than a course of a day. That would be aggravating to do, but it is something that would fix this. Even a Spectre who's in this kind of a situation for, I don't know, a few weeks, a month, that's going to cause some problems. It's going to start to eat at them, wear at them, right? Cool. Option 2, don't make them Spectres. Don't make them Delta Ops, right? Don't send in these super elites and then have them act like first-year grunts, we were talking about this on camera while we were discussing this point, because there's actually a lot of different groups of people you could pull from. Maybe it's some civilians who were civilians and have since taken up arms. Maybe they were some of the groups that are armed by the CIA. Maybe they're trying to make do of it. And they, of course, have none of the military training and none of the discipline and none of the anything experience necessary to be a Delta Op. So they're just like, and they go through all this stuff. Makes perfect sense. No issues. But you could see how that wouldn't quite work, because then how do we do the Conrad thing, right? It would fit the wanting to be a hero thing, and I do think that kind of restructure will work. And like I said, I'm not going to go down the list. Several people came up with several other ideas. If you have one, I'd love to hear it too. But I feel like this structure of how the story is built, it occurs over one day, and it involves the elite descending into madness. I feel like this really hinders the overall narrative approach. Again, plot and themes. Now, I wanted to start with that because that's really my only complaint about the narrative. It's a big complaint. But now that we've taken that, acknowledged it, pushed it to the side, let's talk about the meat here. The next game I want to talk about, though, really quick. The next game I want to talk about, it is Borderlands 2. Hear me out. We actually just played Tales from the Borderlands, so this is apropos. Handsome Jack is a better approach than what they did with Walker here. Now, I know I said that my only real complaint was that thing, but I should mention that I feel like the outro, that is to say the final mission, the lead up to the ending and the ending, didn't land it. Now, I've known about the big reveal for some time. You could argue that detracts from my appreciation or experience, and that's valid and possible. My counter-argument is that there are plenty of shows, books, movies, and games that I'm well aware of and am replaying or watching or reading or whatever for the 5,000th time, and it still has the same impact for me, or at the very least, it still has impact for me. So I disagree with that assessment. But if you want to level that argument, that's totally valid. But my point is, I felt like the intro didn't nail it. It didn't land it the way it needed to. It's like we go through this really irritating mission, probably one of the worst missions in the game. And then we go through that's chapter 14. And then we get to chapter 15. We go up there and we walk up, and there's the hallucinatory people who are saluting and surrendering to us because we're the hero. We go up and we see, Conrad, and he's painting a scene of the Willie Pete scene. It's like, okay, that's cool. And then we go out and we find out the truth. Okay. And then we see a couple of flashbacks of, I think, literally 3 or 4 scenes. I think it's 4 scenes of what was actually happening. And there's not really any proper foreshadowing building up to this, in my opinion. Now, that makes sense. After all, this was not something that was originally designed in the script. Now, this wasn't something that was put in last minute, like, say, the helicopter thing. But it was something that was changed in development. And when anybody who knows when you change something in mid-development, there's going to be pieces that don't quite fit with that. So that makes sense. That lines up, and it's logical. My point is, it didn't really properly build up to the reveal, and the reveal didn't really change or add anything to it for me. All it did was add to the overall idea that Walker was completely descending into total mania, which again would have worked much better if he wasn't supposed to be this super elite badass dude. Instead, I'm just left going, okay. And then we leave. We chose the we escape and don't kill our rescuers ending, if you're wondering. And that was it. That was all there was to it. But that's why I say Handsome Jack pulls this idea off better. You're probably thinking, what the hell does Handsome Jack have to do with Walker? So, I'm not going to spoil, but one of Handsome Jack's main character traits was that he was the goddamn hero. You are all nothing but a bunch of bandits, and I am the goddamn hero. And he had the charisma and the oomph and the character arc to support that delusion. Now, Walker doesn't. Hear me out for a second. It's very well portrayed. I actually gave a separate plus for Nolan North, who, honestly, this might be one of the best roles I've ever heard him voice. He does an absolutely phenomenal job of the descent. One of my favorite things is how just the barks, the little vocal clips, when he's pointing out an enemy or targeting someone or shooting someone or when he's hit, change throughout the course of the game until by the end he's just this raging berserker machine who is just screaming and cussing about how much he wants to kill them or rip them off. Another example. You can execute people. Early on, it's very simple. It's just a quick punch or a quick shot. By the end, it is very brutal and very violent. The portrayal of the descent is fantastic. It just doesn't quite land it for the aforementioned reasons, right? And you see why I'm so torn up about this whole thing and why I prefaced all of this with the structure problem I mentioned earlier. Because what I feel from Spec Ops: The Line is the beginning of a fantastic idea. I don't think it nailed it, personally. Now, no offense whatsoever to anybody who thinks it does. Obviously, we had several people in chat who rather enjoy this story, and I'm with it. Again, I gave the story a fairly substantial net positive score, because it is a well-told story, other than the big issue. It's just, I feel like they could have done a lot more and a lot better if this was a Telltale game. And yes, that's my final tie-in there. Well, that's not true. I have to mention Modern Warfare 2 later, but we'll get to that when we get to that. If this game was done in the structure and style of a Telltale game, I'd probably be all over this. And I guarantee you it would be a net positive score. It would be a game I would have overall enjoyed. Because you take away all the boring, padding combat sections. Yes, I know it's supposed to be that way because it gets you into the mood, whatever. Deliberately bad doesn't change it from being bad, as I've said many, many times. And it would focus so much more of its time and attention on what it needed to. Because what this game does is it zooms the camera in super close to 3 people in the middle of conflict, a war zone. And while it has some structural issues, the thematic usage and approach of that element, that human perspective in the middle of hell, worked quite well. It's probably the best part of the narrative for me overall. They do a wonderful job of it. They even... I begin with the end in mind. One of my viewers, who's awesome, mentioned that the game is very surreal, and I agree with that completely. The game is actually surreal, which would also suit a Telltale game better than a modern military shooter, because the overall approach of it doesn't really follow natural waking logic. Now, this is when I go ahead and acknowledge that, yes, there's a predominant theory, which is even held by the primary writer of the game, that he actually died in the crash, and all of this is just him going through this kind of purgatory / final moments, whatever, hell kind of a thing, however you want to think of that. Let me go ahead and say that I don't care for that, even though it would perfectly explain everything that's going on. Because it would. So many of these events don't really follow tangible logic in a way that doesn't really trigger at first, because it's dream logic, right? I've talked about this before. Dream logic makes perfect sense until you think about it. It's just this point connects here. Duh. My favorite example of this, and this is wonderful surreality, is we're always descending in this game. No, physically. There's this wonderful scene where we go and we go down this and we go into the hotel and we go down, and then we go out in front of a massive chasm of city that just happens to be below us. Then we go down, and eventually we go there and then go to the next area and we get a truck, and then we go down some more. And there are a couple of exceptions where we'll go up a staircase, but that's about it. Otherwise, we are constantly going down throughout the whole thing. And that kind of fits. That kind of fits the overall vibe and approach. I mean, even the very nature of this permanent sandstorm, which is encircling Dubai, kind of fits that sort of a thing. It's just this, I don't want to say pocket dimension, but honestly, this feels a lot like a form of purgatory, right? Probably a personal purgatory. Because one of the most common things in dream logic is you can't leave the area you're in the dream because you're there. Doesn't that just make sense? This is where you are, so you don't really leave. You don't really change locations. I know that's not universally true, but you get the dream logic of that, right? So we're just here. We're in Dubai because we're stuck here, and we can't leave because there's this death storm. Okay, that makes sense. I don't know. It's interesting to think about, and it makes me wonder a little bit how better that could have been done, or worse. I should probably mention that I do know that there was a decent amount of executive meddling in this game. Lord knows the co-op mode and the multiplayer mode are probably the best examples of that. But the fact that they kept kind of tacking on things so late into development, is just very 2K Games, isn't it? Because 2K Games sucks, and it's one of the worst video game companies ever. So, fresh reminder on that one. But anyways, we had the Barks, we had the Descent. Walker's cool. I love the doodad utilization. Everything is cool about that. Voice acting, there's some cool stuff. And there's some interesting stuff, but the thing I want to talk about most is the Willie Pete scene. Now, I kept calling it that on camera, partially because I didn't want to, for lack of a better word, I didn't want to give it away, what was going to come. I just realized I still have the game up. Let's exit the game, shall we? Whoops, I'm just recording with the game up. I hope the audio wasn't good. Looks like the audio wasn't getting good. The Willie Pete scene, white phosphorus. That's actually the actual quick terminology term for that, too. White phosphorus, which should never be used on a person in this manner, in a volatile, offensive manner, ever. I know that it's a war crime. I know it's illegal. I don't care. It shouldn't be used because of stuff like we see in this very game. You don't use that on soft targets. That's not how that works. So, I didn't really buy the white phosphorus scene. I ended up not giving it a negative for this. But part of the thing that really bothered me is the attitude of the devs and the people who were talking about the game and the interviews I saw afterwards all supported the same general concept. I already touched on this. That judgmentalism. You should just put the game down. This is your fault for being a video game player, etc., right? You just want this power fantasy. No, I wanted to enjoy a good game. Thank you very much. But the reason I bring all of that up is the idea of using a modern military shooter as a deconstruction of the power fantasy of war things and showing how just killing people isn't actually going to make things better. That sounds familiar, doesn't it? Yeah, you know where I'm going with this. Because I've done a lore run on the Modern Warfare series. That is to say, Modern Warfare 1, 2, and 3. I've also streamed a couple of the other games, but the point is, those core 3 games, and by which I mean 2 games, because Modern Warfare 3 is stupid, really did a much better job of the same exact themes and approach and style than this game did. Less surreal, because those games are supposed to be actually happening, which is hysterical, because they're also very Hollywood. But all of the moments that needed to stick landed so much better in those games. But they also approached their core theme in a different manner. one of the things the writer said, I actually agree with him on this, because I don't want to sound like I'm completely against the dude. I did read the whole interview this very morning while I was waiting at the doctor's, because I wanted to refresh myself and everything. And he mentioned that he didn't want anything to be done just for shock value. And I'm with that. One of the biggest complaints I had with Modern Warfare 3 was that the big shocking moment was done to check the checkbox of shock value and nothing else. However, in Modern Warfare 2 and 1, the big shocking scenes were done to far better effect and for far better purpose. It was a natural, fluid form of the narrative. In fact, the big shock moment in Modern Warfare 1, which I'm still dancing around because I don't want to spoil that one, I've heard several people say that it came so fluidly and so smoothly from the game's narrative that most people didn't even see it happening until it was already upon them. Good, that's how that should work. Which leads us to the white phosphorus scene, okay? So they've been going through this, and they've been having issues, and they think these people are kidnapping civilians, and they're talking about how you broke the truce, and we're going to deal with this. And okay, yeah, so all that we are shown up till this point indicates that these people are going to do something bad to civilians. We need to stop them. We need to save those civvies. There's too many of them. We have white phosphorus. Okay, let's use it. Okay, I admittedly hesitate a little bit there, because even that just kind of makes me go, because there's simply too many other ways around that, especially in the immediacy. This was not a time-urgent situation. They could have scouted more. They could have tried to infiltrate. They could have tried to trap and surround. They could have looked for anything else which could help the situation, but instead they decided to start shooting white phosphorus over there because urgency for no good reason. Problem number one. Problem number two. You, the player, shoot white phosphorus on civilians. Now hold on a second. Before you attack me with sticks, I know you love attacking me with sticks in the comments, but hear me out for a moment. The narrative impact of forcing the player to do a horrible act has a validity to it. It is, however, in my opinion, that should be optional. This is the primary comparison I want to make. So, I cannot finish making this comparison without spoiling Call of Duty 6 Modern Warfare 2. So, spoilers. Okay. No Russian. You probably saw this coming. Or you watched the stream. In No Russian, there's no nice way to say this. You are infiltrating a terrorist group that shoots up an airport full of civilians. It's brutal. It's horrific. It's probably the best scene in the game. It's very least tied for my favorite top 4 scenes in that game. But you don't have to do it twice. You can. You can participate in that. I do know some players who will go through and who will shoot as part of the cover. You're trying to maintain cover. You need to infiltrate. This is my orders. I will do it. And then, the big thing happens. But you don't have to. Now, you could argue that doesn't have the same narrative impact, and that's fine. I'm not going to argue that back. My overall core point here is that Modern Warfare 2 puts that option into your hands. It says here, right when you start up the game, I forget the exact message, but it's like, there is something unpleasant and uncomfortable in this game. If you hit this button, it's gone. You will not have to see that scene. And what happens when you get there is it completely skips the entire massacre and gets right down to when you're doing the actual mission, when you're trying to fight through the airport, the outside, when you're fighting people who are fighting back. Just skips it entirely. Option 2. I did this during the lore run. You don't open fire. You don't shoot any of the civilians. You are effectively a camera watching the scene unfold. 2 options given to the player to not have to participate in this kind of wanton slaughter. This is my core point, and this is the biggest reason why the white phosphorus scene doesn't land for me. Because the game forced me to do this. Or, hang on, there are actually 2 other options. I could have tried to shoot my way through the enemies. They spawn infinitely, and I will eventually run out of ammo and die. And then reload a save and be right back where I started. So that's not really an option. I can also stop playing the game that I paid money for and I'm streaming for the sake of my job. Not really an option. And as I said before, the defense of just stop playing it isn't really a good defense. There was no method of progression that did not involve committing this heinous act. That was not something I was fond of. And the thing is, I wouldn't even be making such a big deal about this, except it's the apex moment of the entire game. When we started streaming this, several people popped into chat, right at the very beginning, like, oh, this is the White Phosphorous game. Because that's like the big scene, right? It's the scene that not only everyone remembers in real life, but also the one that the entire narrative hinges on. I mean, even when we go up to Conrad's room and he's painting the big painting, he's painting the White Phosphorous scene. Because that's the big moment in which he snapped and lost his mind and decided to start descending instead of turning around and getting the hell out of Dodge or doing anything else he could have done, right? It's a big moment that we are forced into. If they had pulled the Modern Warfare 2 trick, I would have preferred that substantially, because then it would be on me, the player, to do it. This is also relevant to the whole judgmental thing I mentioned earlier. Granted, that wasn't really in the game, debatably. I know that's debatable. Some of the load screens are rather overt. But all of that would have been washed away if I didn't have to do that, and I did. And I feel like the game is lesser for the absence of the option. And I want to stress the way I'm saying that, because you could argue the narrative would be weaker if we didn't actually fire that. You could also say, how the hell would you even make that work? Actually, it's really easy. All you'd have to do is make it... The Band-Aid fix I came up with right off the top of my head while I was streaming was, why not make a thing where, oh God, no, we can't use this. There's got to be another way. Another person, Adams maybe, or Lugo goes to use them. Like, it's like, oh my God, no, what are you doing? White Phosphorous goes over. It's effectively a cutscene. There's nothing you can do about it. It's like, holy crap, what do we do? And you're probably thinking, well, then why would Walker feel guilty? Because Walker didn't stop him. I could have stopped him. I just stood there and watched as these people got burned to death alive. That's actually worse than that, but do me a favor, don't ever look up what White Phosphorus does to people. I could have stopped that. I could have prevented that. Granted, that's not a super awesome option. It doesn't quite hit the same way. I understand that. But again, that's a right off the top of my head Band-Aid. I do think there's other ways they could have structured this so that they could have either bypassed that or not put it directly on the player. And this is such an important point because it's pretty much the big point of the game. You'll notice I've been talking about just this one scene for like the last 5 minutes or whatever it's been at this point. I have no idea how long it's been. I don't have the timer bar under YouTube under me. That would be weird, wouldn't I? Just have a timer bar on my desk and I'm like, what the heck is this? Believe it or not, it's also one of the last things I really have to share about this work. I do like it better as a surreal work. I just don't think it should be a we're already dead thing. There's a lot of other ways you can make that work. Going fully into fantasy or making it a more dynamic world or even going into the science fiction direction or whatever. There's a lot of ways you could do that. Maybe do it as a tale. I've talked many times about the difference between a tale and a story. And so not make it a linear, actual, cohesive series of events. Just make it stuff that's happening, I think there's ways they could have made this work. And I do still think it is a very well told story. I just think that it's severely hampered by not quite nailing the thing they were going for and being very unfun to play. I guess that's actually all I got. I'm dreading the comments this week. Let me tell you what. I'll see you next time.